Thank you all for coming here today. I really appreciate seeing how many folks have turned out for all these different workshops for the No to APEC Coalition. It's something that started with just a few meetings, especially those of us on the kind of leadership side of No to APEC. It was just a couple meetings with a couple people, and it's really grown into something spectacular that we see here today, and really beautiful. APEC's agenda has first and foremost always been a neoliberal agenda, meaning that APEC was created to help big corporations rig the rules of the global economy in their interests. It's a venue for government officials, CEOs, and other big interests to meet and discuss ideas about the global economy. And while they're having those discussions, the Biden administration wants to announce something really big this year. They want to announce something that demonstrates the United States' commitment to and power over the Asia-Pacific region. This is an effort to assert dominance on the Asia-Pacific region. And that's a trade deal called APEC, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So APEC is the discussion forum for it, but IPEF is the binding pact that they're trying to announce there. So IPEF is this massive new trade proposal that's poised to set rules governing more than 40% of the global economy by itself. And it's also set to become a model for subsequent trade deals that the US has already negotiated in Africa, the Americas, and Europe. So the rules established in IPEF could very quickly end up covering most of the world. But I want to say, because of pressure and previous organizing that's gone on for decades and decades, from people here, from people all over the world, the Biden administration has been forced to take a lot of the traditional corporate giveaways from past US trade agreements off the table for this one. So this is because of wins from people like us. Like, we have fought for each of these wins. So there's no giveaways to big pharma that'll extend patent monopolies and jack up medicine prices. There are no tariff cuts that make it easier to offshore jobs to places where people are making starvation wages and create a race to the bottom. There's no public procurement rules that would limit buy local and buy green rules when it comes to public purchasing preferences. And the big one, there is no investor-state dispute settlement system, or ISDS, which gives corporations special tools for attacking environmental laws and other public interest policies. So the most dangerous example of what they're trying to do in IPEF right now is these digital trade rules being pushed by big tech that would undermine consumer privacy, AI accountability, and worker rights, which we'll get into in a little bit. But those digital trade proposals need to be stopped. What I want to do right now is pass it to my colleague, Arthur, who's going to give kind of an overview of some of these fights. He's the executive director of the Trade Justice Education Fund. He is one of the instrumental figures in stopping some of the worst aspects of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and making sure the United States was not part of that deal. He is a true warrior in the trade justice movement, and I'm really happy to have him here today. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everybody for the opportunity to speak with you today. So again, my name is Arthur Stimoulis. You see him pronouns. I am the executive director of both Citizens Trade Campaign and the Trade Justice Education Fund. Citizens Trade is the US-based coalition of labor, environmental, family farm, faith, consumer groups that's worked together on trade policy since the original NAFTA debate in the early 90s. And Trade Justice is a newer nonprofit that, among other things, works on emerging issues in trade policy like the digital trade agenda that we're going to hear about in a couple minutes. Starting after World War II, the United States really started pushing this idea of free trade, meaning no tariffs, no quotas, like the ability to ship goods across borders without taxes, right? That's what it meant back then. But starting certainly by the 1970s, if you looked at the data, those trade surpluses started turning into trade deficits. As other countries, particularly in Asia, were able to, get production, factories up and running again, they started selling more to the US. And corporations, of course, realized, hey, wait a minute, we can make stuff overseas more cheaply and export it back here. So it was working for them. But in that sort of boom time, the idea of free trade as a policy tool and a toolkit sort of had become an orthodoxy. right? Like, you must liberalize trade, you must privatize, you must let the market solve society's problems. It wasn't just like one option among many options that you use, it became like an immutable law of nature to some of these folks. And of course, that was enforced by corporations who are profiting from the system, right? Who are profiting from, exploiting lower cost labor, from ignoring workplace safety standards, from ignoring environmental standards, and then just importing, products back in the United States. And so by the 80s, by the 90s, corporations were making tons and tons of money off of this. And then they also added an additional twist. They realized that this free trade brand was so popular among politicians and among members of Congress that they could start sneaking in other stuff into trade agreements that really had nothing to do with the trade of goods across borders. And so one of the big things they pushed for was called regulatory harmonization, right? Making regulations the same across the world. But when they talked about regulatory harmonization, they were talking about creating ceilings above which no countries could pass stronger regulations. And a more stark way to put that was they were putting caps on democracy, right? So, you had this situation where in the United States, first and foremost, we saw millions and millions of good-paying jobs shipped overseas. All that offshoring put a very real downward pressure on wages and benefits of the jobs that are left. Besides racism and sexism, the offshoring of jobs is like the major driver of income inequality in the United States. So not good for American workers. Meanwhile, around the world, you see medicine prices increase, you see extractive industries, rip and ship, resource extraction increase. One of the big impacts of free trade agreements has been agricultural dumping, particularly in the Americas. After NAFTA passed and then CAFTA, you saw massive amounts of grains from the United States flooding the market in Mexico and Central America, forcing family farmers off their land, millions upon millions of them, far exceeding the numbers of new maquiladora and sweatshop jobs that were created under NAFTA. People leaving the rural areas, moving to cities, moving to the northern border to look for work, and if they can't find work, many risking their lives, crossing the border, only to be met by racism and xenophobia here. So you have this system where corporations, are exploiting labor, they're ignoring environmental regulations, they're ignoring consumer safety regulations, and governments are being told, hey, you can't intervene in the market, except for in some instances where people, of course, have more power and more privilege to do so. It just sort of like sets a little context. Will has already talked about the transition, that new reality that people are fighting back has caused the powers to be to try different things, try new things to get their trade agenda moving forward again. So one of the things they try is instead of doing these massive trade deals, we're going to try small, what they call bilateral trade agreements with just one country and hope that people don't get pissed off. IPEF is not a small deal. IPEF, as Will said, is a massive deal. Covers 40% of the global economy. It's also intended as what's called a docking agreement, meaning that other countries can dock on or join over time. But the Biden administration, trying to get around the anger that already exists, has, as Will said, done a few things already to try to dissipate some of that anger. So no investor-state dispute settlement, in which corporations are given new tools to individually challenge environmental laws and public interest policies, no new giveaways to big pharma to raise medicine prices, no public procurement chapter, meaning bans on buy local and buy green, which are really important for the rapid transition to a clean economy, and no tariff cuts, which hopefully saves some manufacturing jobs here and prevents agricultural dumping on other countries. But just because we kept some of the bad stuff out doesn't mean there isn't other bad stuff in there, and it doesn't mean that what we need in there is going to be added. But members of Congress are starting to get pissed. And if they understand that people are pissed in hearing about this and that they can't slide it under the radar, we actually still have a chance of winning. They might announce something in principle, but there's a long way to go between announcing something in principle and actually imposing draconian rules on us for decades. And we can win this fight. So I appreciate everyone's work helping make that happen.
Next, I want to pass to Hillary Hayden. She is the organizing director for the Trade Justice Education Fund and the former director of the Washington Fair Trade Coalition. Welcome, Hillary.
I want to thank Will for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to talk about the stuff that is kind of new, that has shown up in trade policy in the last, 5 years maybe. It's not going to surprise anybody in this room that there was no digital trade chapter in the original NAFTA in the 1990s, when none of us had internet yet, or cell phones. So I'm going to narrow in for most of my comments on the digital trade agenda on AI rules and algorithms, because I think that's a thing that every person in this room is probably hearing about every day on the news and in your class, and when you turn your assignment in and your professor wants to know if you use ChatGPT. I want to flag that the digital rules are broader than that. They also cover things like cross-border data flows. Who in what country can get access to your data? Can a company take your data from your cell phone with your name and your phone number and personal info attached to it? And where can that information go without you knowing about it, right? So that's one thing that it covers and addresses that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It also covers competition rules. It also covers a lot more specifics on data privacy and that kind of thing. So algorithms are basically computer learning that are fed a whole bunch of data and then proceed to make decisions based on that data, right? Almost every day there seems to be news about cool new uses of AI that people are excited about, that people are engaging with. But I think just as frequently there seems to be some news about issues related with the tech. And for us, a lot of those issues that we're concerned about are related to discrimination, and they're related to biases that are being built into and amplified by under-regulated algorithms. So there are super well documented examples of racial and gender biases that are being built into AI-aided hiring practices, criminal justice situations, provision of public services, search engines, facial recognition, self-driving cars, a whole host of areas that impact our lives on a daily basis. In Indiana, in Arkansas, in Idaho, and in Oregon, errors that were made by algorithms that were used by states to give out certain kinds of public services kept senior citizens off Medicaid benefits that they were entitled to. In Michigan, an algorithm that was meant to root out fraud in the welfare system accused 48,000 recipients of fraud, of having received fraudulent benefits from the state. That was a 5-fold increase from a prior system, and without any intervention by the state government. They went after those people that they had decided got benefits fraudulently by garnishing their wages, taking their tax refunds, levying their bank accounts, and the stress that it took on folks that were wrongly accused resulted in evictions, destroyed credit scores, bankruptcies, and suicide. These are real life impacts that algorithms are having on our communities, and these are just in the United States. There's been a lot of interest over the last year on both sides of the aisle in finding ways to rein in big tech's influence. And like Elizabeth Warren said on a webinar this year with one of our national partners, giant corporations have one great trick. If it looks like regulators just might ring you in, you need to send out your corporate lobbyists to rig a trade deal. From big pharma to big ag to big banks, giant corporations have a long history of using bad trade deals to pad their profits and chip away at protections for workers and consumers. And this is unfortunately the exact process that we have watched play out over the last year with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But a lot of groups have put out research on this year. Well-respected organizations across the digital organizing scene have really been sounding the alarm about this. AI Now, which is at Columbia University, put out a paper talking about how these digital trade rules are basically meant to intervene in a moment when there is movement toward wanting more proactive monitoring of AI systems. The AFL-CIO's Technology Institute put out a report on worker-centered digital policy that stands in really sharp contrast to what the tech companies are pushing in IPEF. We don't want trade deals that are going to be built off of IPEF to be used to shield companies from accountability, for discrimination, for labor abuses, and for other kinds of abuses of AI that I feel relatively confident in saying we may not even be able to anticipate right now in 2023. Seasoned trade activists are pretty familiar with the fact that trade deals lock in rights for corporations for a really long time, and that it's extraordinarily difficult to unlock these so-called rights once they're set in place. The thing that I want to say when it comes to AI is let's just not lock bad rules in the first place. Let's just not set those standards in place in the first place to have to wait them later at some point. That it looks like, thanks to the activist left's work on this issue over the last year, that the worst of the digital provisions are actually not going to be in IPEF. We don't know. It's going to get announced in the next week, the next few days. But it looks like the worst of those digital provisions are not going to be in there. And that's something that is a huge, huge win for the trade justice movement. And it's a thing that we were kind of initially told would be really difficult and near impossible to do. So I want to thank folks for being here. I'm really excited for Q&A. But that's what I have for now. Thank
you. So our next speaker is Sonia Reed-Smith. She's a legal advisor and senior researcher at the Third World Network, an international coalition specializing in development issues and North-South affairs.
Thanks very much. So, for example, in the digital chapter, we see that the US Chamber of Commerce, the US Council for International Business, Google, the Industry Association for Facebook, Amazon, and so on, still want things in this digital chapter that we think are still there. They have not been suspended by the US government in the last few weeks. And one of them is that they want to ban taxes when you download stuff from the internet. But now people download them, even in developing countries. They download them from Netflix, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon, and so on. But what the big tech companies want at IPEF is a permanent, enforceable ban on imposing taxes on downloading video games or music or movies and so on. And this is a serious revenue loss for developing countries. A second provision that's in the digital chapter that's problematic both for developing countries and we think developed countries is deregulation of electronic transactions. So what is this? That if you went shopping with your credit card, for example, and you went to Walmart and you paid with a credit card, Walmart would send your credit card details unencrypted to their head office, so everybody could steal your credit card number and go shopping online. So this caused millions of dollars in losses to millions of American consumers, so your Federal Trade Commission stepped in and said, right, credit card and debit card numbers must be encrypted in transit. But what big tech wants in IPEF is to say, no need to regulate here, we leave it to the companies and the customers to decide how secure these transactions are. As customers, we have no power, right? We can't decide what they're going to do. And what we see is there's this market failure, because if your credit card details get stolen because Walmart sent them unencrypted, it's not Walmart who pays, it's you or the bank. So why would Walmart spend more money encrypting them? Developing countries have concerns, that the demands by CropLife and the Industry Association for Monsanto and Dow and DuPont will make it harder to regulate genetically modified organisms. A lot of developing countries have quite strong laws and they don't want contaminated shipments coming in, contaminated with a GMO they haven't approved. And if it does come in, what can they do with it? Can they destroy it? Can they send it back? Do they have to consume it? So this is the kind of regulation that we're worried could be undermined in the agriculture chapter, because that's what Monsanto and DuPont and CropLife and Cargill have been demanding in IPEF. Then there's a chapter called Services Domestic Regulation Disciplines, and this is about deregulating services. So this can affect labour, environment, health, human rights, a whole wide range of sectors. And here the US Chamber of Commerce, the US Council for International Business, they have asked for restrictions on services licensing fees. Licensing fees can be a tool for the government to discourage things they don't want, or to raise revenue, or to cross-subsidise, say, public hospitals from private hospitals. But in IPEF, we're worried it will restrict the licensing fees to just what is reasonable, and not restricting the supply of the service. But what we're worried in IPEC is it might apply more broadly on a negative list basis, which would be all sectors except those you list. So automatically new service sectors, the new Uber or Airbnb, you can't restrict. And more sectors, or it might apply to all sectors, we don't know. And we don't know if it applies to all levels of government or just the national government. So in the US, for example, I understand in California, the city of Santa Ana, I think, gets a lot of its revenue from these licensing fees, because local governments can't charge many taxes, right? They can't charge corporate tax, they can't charge income tax, they can't charge tariffs. What can they do is they can charge licensing fees. So that city, for example, uses licensing fees to pay for the salaries of the police and fire department. So if they can't get that licensing fee revenue, well then that's a whole lot of public services supplied by your local governments, which in some countries is public health clinics, it's street lighting, it's garbage collection, but also police and fire departments that you can't get the revenue for. So in the services chapter, the services domestic regulations chapter, the big companies like Cargill, big pharmaceutical companies, Amazon, Google, Facebook, also want restrictions on how you can regulate services. So that is a problem both for developing countries and also for developed countries, because again, it's the corporations saying, don't regulate us, we want deregulation. So they use these treaties, as I think you've heard, as a backdoor way of getting deregulation that they might not be able to get through your Congress or through your state legislatures or your city governments. Instead, they use these trade treaties as a backdoor. And then the last chapter I wanted to mention is one called Good Regulatory Practices. And this one is apparently exporting your Reagan-era difficult to regulate regime. And so what it does is, for example, says before you can have a labour law or a health law or an environmental law, any kind of regulation, you have to do a regulatory impact assessment to see, do we really need regulation? So these regulatory impact assessments can cost $2 million per regulation. So that's pretty unaffordable for developing countries, and some of the countries in IPEF, some of the developing countries have tried it, but their ministries have said, we can't afford it, it's too hard. And these regulatory impact assessments can become a stick to beat the government with. So it becomes very difficult for governments to regulate. And we worry that these provisions based on the US-Mexico-Canada agreement will also allow companies the ability to lobby for existing laws and regulations to be repealed, whether it's labour laws or environment laws or human rights laws or health laws. And we see that it opens the door for them to influence the policy-making process. So this is why developing countries are worried that IPEF will be difficult, burdensome, expensive for them to implement and restrict their ability to regulate and unwind any good regulations they already have on climate change, health, labour rights, and so on. Thanks.
Campaign co-director for the San Francisco Living Wage Coalition, and we're a part of the California Trade Justice Coalition. And people often ask us, well, why is trade a wage issue? And we respond, well, we're not going to be able to win a living wage for everybody in the United States as long as corporations can move across this imaginary line in the sand and pay $4 per day. We've always found that trade and immigration has been linked together, where corporations are free to move capital, factories across borders, but workers are restricted from crossing borders. The answer to free trade is cross-border solidarity and supporting workers across borders, supporting workers' right to organize a union in particular. We see that having a union is the best step towards being able to fight for higher wages and better working conditions. There was an example when in the US Congress they started renegotiating the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, as the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. And there was a big movement built in this country between labor, the AFL-CIO, the Public Citizen, California Trade Justice Coalition, all across the country, a movement to put pressure on Congress to have some kind of worker protections in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. What we're calling for is those minimal protections that are in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement to be in IPEF. But you know what we're also learning from experience is that those minimal protections are very limited. So in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, there's a provision called the rapid response mechanism. If workers file a complaint that their rights are being violated, particularly their right to organize a union, then that obligates the U.S. Department of Labor, the Mexican Ministry of Labor to investigate, to have some kind of remediation plan to address those issues. And if the company doesn't abide by that, there's a series of sanctions that can be taken against the company, including barring it from exporting into the other country. And remember, these plants are all set up for export to the United States. We're now putting pressure on the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Trade Representative that they need to go after the company itself, and not just, you know, that they're throwing up their hands and saying, well, you know, okay, this is one facility that we lost. You know, well, no, you need to go after the company, VU Manufacturing. You also need to pierce the corporate veil to find out who are the investors in the companies that are involved in that, because the suspicion is that it's other second-tier auto parts companies that have set up that corporation. The other thing is to make sure that company and those companies don't set up some other plant in Mexico.